With all the looking ahead and looking back of the COVID years, I have been challenged to look farther back and attempt to put things into perspective. The note I received read, "What about the changes, on and off, of perspective, generations, eras, history, democracy, technology, God?" Well, how else could a history major respond? Bring it on! Like most my age, many a sentence begins with, "When I was your age," or "in my day," to the rolling of eyes of children or grandchildren. But there's a lot of truth to be found in what we choose to remember, what we draw attention to, and those things which we just ignore. Why we remember some things and forget others usually relates to what is to our own advantage or the impact it has on our image in the eyes of others. That's true as a nation as well as to individuals. But there is a lot that is worth remembering. There has been more social change since Canada became a country in 1867 than in all the generations that went before, right back to the time of the cave folk. Think of the role of women. Every female in Canada has the right, indeed the law requires it, to get an education. Reading, writing, mathematics, history, science, all just a book and a classroom away. Yet, when we look back through history, there are so few writings of women preserved, because they were not literate and could not record their thoughts or concerns. How many Marie Curies were silenced by their exclusion from learning? Look at the Bible, the contents determined by men that ignore the concerns and interests of women, because women's writings were few and not deemed worthy of inclusion. Or they can appear in a book bearing the name of a man. Every time I read the poetry of the Song of Solomon, I see a woman's hand. "The voice of my beloved, look, he comes leaping upon the mountains, bounding over the hills. My beloved is like a gazelle or a young stag." That's a man's opinion? And I long to hear the stories of the Virgin Mary and the Mary Magdalene and Lydia, the seller of purple at the gates. They're not there. The first woman elected to Toronto City Council, Constance Hamilton, served from 1920 to 1921. And in 1921, Agnes Campbell MacPhail became the first woman elected to the House of Commons. In 1943, Agnes MacPhail once again, along with Margaret Ray Lucock, became the first two women elected as members of the provincial parliament at Queen's Park. Today, women are found at all levels of government. Admittedly, not in equal numbers, but no novelty is seen in their governing. My parents grew up in a world of horsepower, real horses providing the power. In fact, horses were still employed by the streets department in Toronto until 1946. Our milkman delivered by horse-drawn wagons into the 1950s. Today, cars, tractors, trucks, airplanes, trains, atomic-powered submarines, rockets to the moon are our realities. For the times they are a-changin', as Bob Dylan would note. The Toronto I grew up in was very white and very shut down on Sundays. After all, Sundays were a day of rest, devoted to church and family. It was only in 1938 that public parks had been open to visitors on Sunday, and then only if no competitive games were played, except tennis for some reason. And children's playgrounds and apparatus were shut tight and locked. By 1961, shamed by a city council that warned us that Europeans saw us as very provincial country bumpkins, that movie theaters were allowed Sunday opening. And a year later, our city went wild and opened up the bars. Well, after church hours, of course. Well, church attendance has never been the same. For those of us into genealogy as a hobby, it's very common to see 3 or 4 generations living in the same house, particularly if it's a farmhouse. Daughters lived at home until they married. even if they never did, and sons tended to follow their father's footsteps into his workplace. Today, it's far more common for children to move out as soon as they are self-sufficient, often not returning after university or if they worked away from home. Adult children free up their parents to downsize and travel, leaving no empty room for a subsequent return. Even rarer is to see the very elderly living in the same house as grandchildren. Instead, when no longer able to live alone, a retirement residence is favored. Dependence and reliance are more comfortably dealt with by strangers than having your own children tending one's more intimate needs. Interestingly, today there has been a resurgence in multi-generational living arrangements, with emigration from countries where that is still common. It will be interesting to see if a generation from now that continues, or will the greater independence model prevail. But, as was suggested, let us look farther back. We laud the ancient Greeks for giving us democracy, philosophy, astronomy, mathematics, medicine, Aristotle, Britannica, even the Olympics. But we willfully ignore the part of their philosophy that addresses human rights, slavery, and women. Such rights were not included in the outlook of ancient Greece. Slavery was accepted as a normal part of society. Aristotle believed that the goal of a civilized man was to attain a life of leisure, thereby freeing him to pursue the higher things in life. They also believed that the laws of nature meant that such leisure was attained by free men ruling and dominating slaves and women. It's estimated that 100,000 slaves were in Athens, while the total population was around 250,000. So it's important to acknowledge that while we do not share their perspective on human rights, it is appropriate that we recognize the advances that those leisure hours gave the world that benefit so many to this day. Of course, with the woke folk, we have reversed that process. They forget the good of the past and exalt and condemn only the errors, malice, or decisions that produced unexpected or undesirable results. We need to be more balanced. Consider Egerton Ryerson and the renamed Ryerson University. He has been condemned for his limited involvement in residential schools. The man who spoke Ojibwe and was a respected teacher and friend to the indigenous people, given the name Cheek-Chak, bird on a wing in 1826, who fought for their land rights against the encroaching settlers. Ryerson, a Methodist minister, believed that poverty should not be a roadblock to education and that all should have a free and mandatory public education, including girls and the indigenous. He can rightly be called the father of education in Ontario. As a Methodist minister, he also believed that schools should teach Christian morals to improve the individual and help society progress. And now the school that once bore his name is referred to by its new abbreviated title as Torment You by many of its students, including my granddaughter. We need to examine the past and learn from it. We need to accept that mistakes can be made with the best of intent. We need to acknowledge that different times call for different solutions. We need to celebrate the best of the past and work toward a more perfect future. Most of all, we need to acknowledge that we too make mistakes. And when we do, we need to do our best to remedy and apologize and atone. But let us ever be guided by the words of Christ. Let the one without sin cast the first stone. So may it be. Amen. Nothing like a challenge to get the juices flowing and the research bug going. It's been a great week thanks to the viewer who offered the idea for these thoughts. If you have a suggestion, do send it along.